The year was 1960. In Greensboro, North Carolina. Segregation was still rife, even though African Americans were given a few more equalities. The federal court case Brown v. Board of Education deemed separate but equal public facilities as unlawful in 1954, and buses in Montgomery, Alabama were desegregated as the result of Martin Luther King Jr.'s bus boycott in 1956. A few years later, 4 male African-American students from North Carolina's A&T University frequently sat in a dorm and talked about the woes of college life and having different skin color than those being afforded more rights than them. Eventually, the action they chose to perform would change the nature of the civil rights movement. David Richmond, Franklin McCain, Azell Blair Jr., and Joseph McNeil all sat down in the white-only section of a lunch counter at a local Woolworth's on the afternoon of February 1st, only to peacefully return to the university hours later. The cause of this minor rebellious act was a reaction to the treatment the 4 students experienced in their lives. Formal greetings were unequal between residents in Greensboro. For example, a white person walking down the street had to be addressed as Mr., Miss, or Mrs. Whites, on the other hand, called blacks by their first names or simply as boy. Jim Crow laws were still enforced, despite the United States Supreme Court's dismissal of segregated facilities in Brown v. Board of Education. Furthermore, days previous to the sit-in, Joseph McNeil had been refused service at a restaurant after he left the bus at Union Station in the city and returned to his dorm hungry. Humiliation, injustice, and their criticism at older blacks for their passivity in the face of repeated racial insults were the forces behind the students' actions at a Woolworth's lunch counter. The day after their first sit-in, the 4 students returned to the same lunch counter to sit in the white-only section, but the second time they were met with hostile white people and the news reporters. Richmond, McCain, Blair Jr., and McNeil became the Greensboro 4 shortly after and were treated as heroes on the university campus. Spread of word on television and newspapers not only affected Greensboro, but other cities in the United States. University and high school students of both black and white skin tones began sit-ins in their local areas. In February alone, students held sit-ins at lunch counters in 11 cities in North Carolina, 7 in Virginia, 4 in South Carolina, 3 in Florida, 2 in Tennessee, 1 in Kentucky, and 1 in Maryland. Over time, the circle of protests widened to Georgia, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, West Virginia, and even Ohio. Overall, the fledgling civil rights movement transitioned from a passive role to a more active role. When sit-in activists were arrested, they unintentionally began jail-ins, in which they chose to stay in jail rather than pay a fine to be freed. In the wake of Woolworth sit-ins came the creation of the more radical Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Freedom Rides of 1961, James Meredith's integration of the University of Mississippi, student voter registration drives during the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964, and ultimately the rise of the Black Power movement.